Hey guys, I'm Roden. Welcome to another episode of Bomispirit. This is the 5th episode of the Bomispirit series here on YouTube. So on this episode today, we're going to be talking about sacred geometry. Super basic 101 kind of introduction talk, and then we're going to talk about the 5 Platonic Solids very briefly. Now I'm going to discuss this live on my Patreon on September 19th, almost said September 11th, past that date, at 7 p.m. Pacific, and I'll be doing a sister episode for my Bomispirit Uncut series on the 12 chakra system and the Merkaba, also on my Patreon. So go ahead and check that out if you're curious. But getting back to this episode, so what's sacred geometry? Right? This is something that's really prominent in the spiritual community. We've got our tapestries of these different geometric shapes and symbols. We've got our tattoos, right? Sacred geometry seems to be everywhere, but I don't think that there's many discussions on what it is, right? So sacred geometry is the understanding that our existence is made up of naturally occurring geometric patterns. This does relate to the theory and thought that we are in a designed reality, okay? Just saying that that is something that is out there in the ether in our reality as far as a thought form, okay? Now, everything that I'm about to say in this video is not all-encompassing information. It also is not a finite perspective on sacred geometry. This is kind of the cool thing of our reality and where we're going as a collective, especially when it comes to unity consciousness, right? Where we understand that there are different ways of looking at something in different perspectives, and at the end of the day, there's just all these cool ways we can look at something, and it doesn't have to be super finite. There is no I'm right and they're wrong. So this video is really just to give you a little taste of what sacred geometry is and just a little information, and anything else that you find or resonates with you, by all means, go for a deep dive of knowledge. I'm all about that, okay? So coming back to sacred geometry. So understanding this is a universal thought form, you could say, a universal understanding that we've had through time and different cultures. Like the Merkaba, for example. Merkaba has been referenced in Jewish mysticism through the book of Ezekiel. That's like one really big reference. We even have different shamanic cultures using sacred geometric patterns for healing and for harnessing elements and elemental energy. So it's kind of seen across the board throughout time, right? And if you feel like it is part of our proof that this is a designed reality, then by all means, and that is your truth. But let's get a little further into these geometric shapes. So we have 5 Platonic solids. 5 Platonic solids were named after Plato, even though technically Pythagoras identified them, but let's not get into that. I'm a big Pythagoras fan, but Plato gets credit for that, even though, again, it doesn't matter, but I'm just putting that out there. So 5 Platonic solids, what makes these shapes even important? They're 3-dimensional shapes that are considered the building blocks of our reality. And the reason for that is because they adhere to certain properties. They all have equal faces. And like faces, by faces I mean sides, but they're 3-dimensional shapes, which is why we call them faces, right? And if you add up all the angles that these faces make with each other, they all are less than 360 degrees, which means they can fit inside of a circle. That's why they're considered the building blocks. We haven't come across any other shapes, 3-dimensional shapes, let me put that out there, 3-dimensional shapes that fit those properties. Not to say they don't exist, but those are the 5 that we know about, and those are the 5 that we kind of adhere to. Now, those are building blocks for our reality. But when you get into sacred geometry, there are all kinds of shapes, right? Like Flower of Life and Merkaba are just really popular ones, but we have all kinds of different ones. And they're really made up of squares, circles, triangles, lines, crosses, spirals. And you can even look at that, like those particular shapes, as certain building blocks of sacred geometric patterns, not just our existence or our reality, right? And if you really want to get technical, we really only have lines and circles, right? Because even squares and triangles are made up of lines. And typically in sacred geometry, circles are seen as feminine, lines are seen as masculine, typically. Now, that being said, let's get into the 5 Platonic solids a little deeper. So of the 5, we have 3 that are made up of equilateral triangles. And then there's one that's made up of pentagons, and then there's one that's made up of squares. So let's go over the ones that are made up of equilateral triangles. For those of you who hated math class, hated geometry, equilateral triangles means that all the sides are equal. They're all the same. which is part of the properties of these 5 Platonic solids, right? All the faces are equal, all the same. So the first one is tetrahedron, probably the most popular one. Typically represents fire, and I say typically because that's just most commonly understood as representing an element in different cultures. Doesn't mean that there's different understandings out there, but that's just typical. That's typical. The tetrahedron has 4 equal faces, and as I already said, is represented by fire. And then we have the octahedron, which has 8 equal faces and represents air. And then we have icosahedron, has 20 equal faces and represents water. And because they have these, because these shapes represent these elements, you can use it for certain healing in relation to these elements. Like, for example, water, that'd be emotional healing, right? Air, I would perceive as wisdom, as like healing any mental blockages or anything of the sort. Now, again, these are just common understandings on how to use these shapes. You can look at them, right? Looking at them is the most popular way to use them. You can create the shapes using candles and things of that nature. You can even get little talismans that are the shape themselves to actually work with these geometric patterns, okay? Now let's get into the other 2. Hexahedron has 6 equal faces, and that's the one that's made up of squares. And that typically represents earth, which again would be like physical healing that you would need, right? And then we have dodecahedron. Dodecahedrons are made up of pentagons, and dodecahedron has 12 equal sides, 12 equal faces. So those are the 5 Platonic solids that make up our existence. But as I said before, the other common shapes you will find in all kinds of geometric patterns: squares, triangles, circles, spirals, crosses, lines themselves, even the Merkaba, which I said I'll be doing an episode on by itself. But even the Merkaba, you start with the flower of life. You start with the 13 sacred circles, which is feminine energy. And then from each circle, you draw a line to all the other circles. Makes an insane amount of lines, but that represents masculine. And what do you end up with? You end up with 2 tetrahedrons, masculine and feminine. Again, I'm doing a video on the Merkaba later, but just to give you a little bit of taste on how all of these connect, right? You have the really common shapes that make up a 5 Platonic solid. There's actually more in there than just that one, but that's, like I said, another video. But I hope you guys enjoyed this. And if you guys are joining me for the live discussion on the 19th, I look forward to hanging out with you guys and just keeping it casual. All my live discussions, by the way, are super casual. You can bring a drink or 2 if you want, and we just hang out and we just talk about stuff, all right? Just so you guys know. But I do hope that you guys enjoyed this, and I hope you guys have a really good night. Everything else you need is linked below, so don't forget to check out Vimeo, Patreon, Instagram, the website, everything else. And I'll see you guys soon. Namaste.